La diffusion vient de démarrer. Tous les participants sont en mode écoute seul.
Hello, my name is Steven Schroefs. I'm the Chief Editor of Fleet Europe, and welcome to this Fleet Europe webinar in partnership with the IFMI, the International Fleet Managers Institute. The International Fleet Managers Institute is the dedicated training and expertise sharing platform for international fleet managers only. And the International Fleet Managers Institute, or IFMI, also stimulates forward action and it triggers innovative thinking in vehicle fleet management today and tomorrow. And last but not least, the IFMI focuses on best practice sharing and interaction. And also in this webinar, you will have the opportunity to learn from recognized fleet peers and experts. And at the end of the webinar, as we usually do, there is the possibility to ask your questions to our experts in a Q&A session. So, today we are going to talk about quite a hot topic: the company car, leasing versus cash allowance, and the rise of private lease. Although vehicle fleet management outsourcing with a preference for full service or operational lease is in many countries an established best practice, we do see a sort of a development in which fleet managers like yourself and company car drivers are looking for possible alternatives. And this steered by elements like taxation, employee retention, and user-centric mobility solutions. Solutions like cash for car, private lease are very trendy today, but can they be of added value for your fleet and your employees? Well, the good news is that our experts that we have invited for this webinar, they have the answer for you. And today we have in total 4 experts to bring you the necessary insight about the topic cash for car versus company car and the rise of private lease. Global Mobility Manager Daan Bieleveld of Royal DSM will explain how he has successfully introduced private lease as a corporate mobility solution. Daan Bieleveld also won last year the Fleet Europe Mobility Award, and so he really knows what to talk about when it comes to mobility solutions and private lease. Mark Van Eck of ALD and Thor Konings of Athlon will do a joint presentation and unravel the framework in which to decide to go for the traditional company car, choose for leasing, or to choose the cash for car option. But let's look first at the legal and fiscal context, and we do that with an expert of BDO. So I hope that our expert of BDO, Mr. Nicolas Stockmans, is in the webinar room. Nicolas, can you hear me?
Yes, sure.
Hello, Nicolas. Hello. Thank you very much that you can join this IFMI webinar. So you are really an expert when it comes, let's say, to legal frameworks, to taxation. And so we all know that in terms of alternative solutions for company cars and for fleet management, that today everything that has to do with taxation is, of course, of importance. So it sounds really interesting that you can start explaining a little bit the legal framework in which we operate today. Is that okay?
Yes, sure.
Okay.
Good afternoon. Okay. First of all, I would like to thank the IFMI for giving us the opportunity to participate to this webinar and provide you with an insight into the tax aspects of the company cars and cash allowances, as well as the difficulties your sector encounters with the current corporate mobility shift from company cars to a range of mobility modes. I will close my presentation with some new tax rules in several countries. But let's see to the context. I think that globally, your sector is in a key moment since many things have recently changed, and it's not over. Indeed, up to now, the company car has been considered as a must in a compensation package. Most of the employees and executives wanted to have this benefit in kind. And even if we see first for the company car, there were a lot of developments. Indeed, until recently, in most countries, diesel cars were the preferred choice for some reasons, like greater fuel economy, lower CO2 emission, lower benefit in kind taxation in the hands of the driver. Recently, the adaptation of new taxation and other rules combined with petrol cars getting cheaper and cleaner are causing a mind switch. We have an increased taxation of diesel cars, both on acquisition as well as on usage. We also have the improved performance and cleaner petrol engines, generally reducing the taxes due in the framework of the acquisition or the use of petrol car. We see that some cities set up low emission zones, which are currently more for older vehicles, but it can be quickly be adjusted. And no car zones are also growing. All of these factors have called into question the absolute necessity to have a company car in any compensation package. Hence, we believe that the current trend of the corporate mobility shift from company cars to cash allowances or to a range of mobility modes like company vehicle, which might be shared, public transport, taxi, Uber, smart mobility solutions such as bike sharing, carpooling, or walking. In short, anything that solves the mobility issue. The problem with this new solution is that up to now, no single European country has tried to find beneficial solution in this area. For instance, if we take the cash allowances, in any country, it's considered as a salary for tax and social security purposes. Consequently, the cost remains very, very high. For the mobility budget, it's very complex because normally it should require a clear fiscal framework, but actually it is necessary to apply the specific tax treatment of any components of the package. And no country has up to now provided for a specific rules in that area. Most fiscal regulation concerning mobility focus on the company car. There is no clear framework for managing such a mobility budget. And yeah, it is a very complex matter, generating a huge extra burden on fleet managers. But at the end of the day, we are quite confident, and because we think that comprehensive fiscal rules will arrive in the long run, if not sooner, and probably from the Netherlands or some Nordic countries. Now I propose to have a quick look at some new rules applicable in several countries. I will start with Belgium. In Belgium, for 2017, we have a new rule for the fuel cards, which generate additional disallowed expenses on the corporate income tax level. As of next year, there should be a cash for car allowances. Practically, it means that it would become possible for the employees who already have a company car to exchange this car for cash compensation and for tax-free, provided that both party, employer and employee, agree with the exchange. We also have an announced corporate tax reform, which will strengthen the rules on the taxation of company car. Most of these new measures should only apply as from 2020. So in these measures, we have, generally speaking, a decrease of the tax deductibility of all the cars. This deductibility rate will be closely linked to the exact CO2 emission level of the car. For the highly polluting cars, the deductibility would be limited to 40%, but this as from 2018. And the deduction for fuel costs will no longer be fixed at 75%, but will be linked to the CO2 emission of the car. And for the electric cars, the deductibility will be for 100% and not anymore for 120%. Now I will evoke the Netherlands. So we have some new rules for electric cars and the reimbursement charging station, which might be tax-free if certain conditions are met. Another point which is common with other countries, the percentage to be applied at the company car was of 25% until 2016. This percentage decreased to 22% as from 2017, and lower percentage are applicable for clean cars. For Luxembourg, we have the same trend. Until last year, when a company car benefit was evaluated based on lump sum basis, there was a fixed percentage of 1.5% to be applied. Since this year, as you may see on the overview on the slide, there is a modulation of this percentage according the CO2 emission of the car and the type of motorization. Initially, I intended to speak about France, but there is no specific amendment in that country. For Italy, the amendments are quite general, so I'm not sure it's interesting to mention. We speak about the corporate income tax rate, but okay, anyway, I don't think it's really relevant. I will close with the UK. In the UK, for several years, the percentage to be applied was based on the CO2 emissions of the concerned vehicle. Based on the recent announcement of the UK government and the overview you have on the slide, we see that year after year, the percentage will increase. The percentage to be applied on the benefiting car will increase, while the threshold of CO2 emission to benefit from the low percentage will continuously decrease. It will close my presentation. I thank you all for your attention and remains at your disposal in case of any questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Nicolas, thank you for explaining a little bit more the legal framework in which we operate in some countries in Europe. I think it's always good to have that context with us, to understand also a little bit more in which field we operate as corporate fleet managers. Now, our next presentation will be presented by two experts in the field of vehicle fleet management and leasing. We have Mark van Eck of ALD, and we have Toch Konings of Athlon, and they will explain a little bit more how to decide on is leasing the best option, when and where, or when can you move, let's say, to an alternative vehicle fleet management solution like Cash for Car. So I hope that both our experts, Mark and Toch, are also in the webinar room. And I think that, Mark, that you will start. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yes, Stephen.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. So we've indeed been asked to speak about the cash allowance versus leasing, and then from a leasing company perspective, how we see the market trends and how we see the evolutions taking place. So if we can go to the next slide. So the question arises, why leasing versus cash allowance as a topic? Why now? Because in essence, it's not really a new discussion. It's a topic which comes up every once in a while, and it does seem to be coming up somewhat more now than before due to the evolution and also availability of more mobility products on the market in certain mature countries. So it's an ongoing discussion and remains very topical. However, as somebody responsible for fleet within your organization, you need to be able to answer questions from within your organization on the subject. You'll no doubt be encountering them, and of course you will need to know how to deal with that, and that's also part of the purpose of this webinar. So you also need to be able to assess the advantages and risks involved when either leasing or providing a cash allowance. Both have advantages, both have certain considerations to take into account as well. Therefore, it's important to be aware of also the different mobility solutions on the market, what's available, and to see what can work best for your organization. So you need to be able to determine what will fit, because they don't fit for all organizations. And it also does depend to a very large extent, as previously mentioned, on what's available in the mature markets. That's initially where it will start. So if we go to the next slide for a moment, and this is then what we are seeing in terms of certain trends in the market. We see on the company side, we see that questions are being raised typically by US-based companies. The reason for that are often that there are significant differences in the way that company cars are provided in the US versus, for example, in Europe or the rest of the world for that matter. It's also the difference between what's typically more job need cars provided in the US versus a combination in Europe of job need cars, for example, for your sales force, and also perk level vehicles, which are then typically for management employees. Also, of course, the cost of vehicles in the US is quite a bit lower than that in Europe, and it can also be a lot more beneficial from a tax point of view to provide company cars in Europe versus America. So that's what we're seeing from the company side. But in addition to that, we also see that companies want to reduce or limit their fleet costs. Needless to say, that's an ongoing objective for any person in fleet, or more to the point in procurement. But by limiting the fleet costs through cash allowances, the fleet costs can be either no longer increased over time, those costs remain static, or in fact they might even decrease going forward. So from an employee point of view, we see that there's a greater flexibility taking place with labor contracts. Also, employees want to be more flexible. Companies want to be able to hire and also reduce workforce as they see the market evolving. So generally, greater flexibility needed there. And that also means that there's a different view on the length of the contract being provided, as is typically the case with lease contracts. So there's a changing view taking place on mobility needs. And a lot of this is also driven by example, by urbanization. We see parking constraints in the major cities, the costs of parking skyrocketing. And also we see the younger generation often has a different view on the use of mobility, looking more at the access to cars rather than perhaps having the actual car itself, be it owned or be it a lease car. So if we go to the next slide for a moment, we see further trends here on the side of governments. We see fiscal changes. We see many fiscal changes, and Nicolas kindly highlighted quite a few. We've seen many over the past years, and if anything, we've seen they are coming more often than before as governments seek to increase their taxable revenue base. So fiscal change with regards to benefit in kind or VAT deductibility, IFRS impact, etc., etc. And these then either make leasing or cash allowance more attractive. From a leasing company side, we see that they are starting to respond to new market needs by developing innovative and also flexible mobility solutions. In fact, responding and adapting to changing needs in the market. And examples of these are car sharing programs being developed, Private Lease, which Dan Bielefeld will no doubt talk a bit more on a bit later on in the webinar. So also Private Lease providing consumers with pricing certainty, so no variable costs other than of course fuel usage, driving more, paying more, driving less, paying less. We also see great investments in leasing companies in the area of digitalization, whereby the leasing companies trying to work more within the integrator role, so acting as an integrator, putting all these different solutions together. And these multi-mobility solutions can be a whole range of different products, varying from mobility solutions, which can be a lease car, car sharing, train cards, bicycles, scooters, you name it, it's all in there. So that's just a few thoughts on what the trends are we see in the market right now. And I'll hand over to my colleague, Thor Konings, for the next part.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Thanks for listing the importance and the relevance of the topic for the companies, for the employees, the governments, and for the leasing companies. So all good and well, but it still leaves our participants in this webinar with quite a bit of questions. So let's try to give an overview of the advantages as well as the considerations of cash allowance and leasing, and hopefully this will help you to decide which option is best suited for your company, the company that you represent. Okay, so first of all, cash allowance. What are the typical advantages? Well, giving your employee a cash allowance is a relatively simple method of provision. On a monthly basis, a cash amount is added to the salary. And when you adopt a cash allowance, the fleet cost will be kept for the company, and future price increases will become the responsibility and the risk for the employee. And in case an employee who has a car on cash allowance, he decides or she decides to leave the company, you are not confronted with cost for early termination. So less longer-term commitments will give you more flexibility. Also for the drivers, the cash allowance option has some advantages. If you get an allowance based on a certain average number of kilometers or miles, and in reality your mileage is lower, the driver takes the benefit. Drivers have the freedom of choice and can spend their allowance as they wish. Best value for money. For example, if the allowance is based on a new Audi A4, the driver can decide to go for a second-hand Audi A6. Drivers who receive a monthly cash allowance have several options that they can choose from to fund a car. They can do their own fund.
Hello? Toch? Sorry, there is, I think, something happening with the sound. Mark, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Let me continue otherwise. On behalf of Thor, maybe I'll rejoin us in a moment.
I don't know where Thor is at the moment. So we were talking about the advantages of cash allowance. Okay, so there are several advantages for the company, let's say, but also for the drivers.
Indeed. So talking about the drivers, the funding method, that's what Thor was explaining before we lost him. So there are different funding methods. He mentioned that there is indeed a personal loan. Then there's also another way of funding it, using own funds, of course, or private lease might offer an alternative as well. Private lease, which has certainly been upcoming quite a bit in a number of countries across Europe. Let's go across to the next slide for a moment, please. So in terms of cash allowance, and there, of course, we can look at the advantages, but now we also need to consider some other points which might be on the downside, which could be effectively disadvantages. And
can you hear me, guys?
Yes, we can.
Thor is back in the room. Okay. Your colleague Mark was already taken over, Thor, but we are all glad that you are back in the webinar room. So as technology is working well again, perhaps you can go on with the considerations when we talk about cash. Okay, thanks.
Yes, I will. So thank you, Mark, for stepping in, and I do apologize, everyone, for the bad connection. But I'm back, and let's continue. So let's move on to some of the considerations. If the driver is responsible to pay and organize for maintenance, repair, and tires, there is a risk that because of time or money constraints, services and tire replacements to the car, they may be delayed, causing safety concerns for the company. The same goes for the insurance. If the provision is incorrect for the driver himself or herself, or for the passengers, or for the load, this could cause safety and liability concerns. So we talked about the advantages for those drivers who have a lower mileage before, but for those drivers with a higher mileage, the cash allowance they receive may not be sufficient to cover the actual cost, for instance, for fuel, for service, maintenance, and repair. Drivers then can tend to reduce business travel significantly. And this side effect could impact your desired business routine. It could, for instance, influence the visit frequency of your important customers. So the flip side of giving the drivers the freedom of choice when choosing their car is that the company is losing control. Drivers may select vehicles that are less representative because of age, are more polluting, or cars that are not fitted with the desired safety specs, like air conditioning, cruise control, airbags, hands-free car kits, etc. This is definitely something to keep in mind, especially when your corporate image, corporate social responsibility, and CO2 emission reduction are important to your company. And lastly, we have this consideration, which was mentioned before in the higher mileage scenario, which is actually applicable in any scenario. And that is the principle that a company is shifting the risk of unforeseen and variable costs related to business travel to the employee. You may want to consider this in your business model if such a shift in risk is fair and reasonable and therefore sustainable. Okay, so far for the advantages and considerations related to the cash allowance setup. Now I'd like to hand over to Mark again to take us through the pros and cons of leasing. Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Tor. So, as mentioned, we'll now look at the advantages and disadvantages of leasing. So, leasing offers an employee benefit. So, employees typically receive a new car every couple of years and often also have a choice of various vehicles and options and accessories to choose from, depending on the flexibility of the relevant car policy within your organization. But it's clearly a benefit to the employee. Then there's also a total cost of ownership approach with leasing, whereby we look at what the best choice is based on the actual running cost of the vehicle, the whole life cost, taking into account the best selection for your car policy. It also provides process efficiencies by the leasing company in the fact that it's what we do. We manage this process from A to Z. That's our core competence. Also, it facilitates budget forecasting by providing cost certainty and also having fixed monthly lease amounts. So the variable being, of course, if one drives again more, you pay more fuel. If you drive less, you pay less fuel. So you know upfront what your costs are going to be, and you can work that out for the next 3, 4, 5 years going forward. Also, leasing companies can then help to implement car policies, not just the policy itself, but also control it, to manage it, and also to monitor compliance. So we can do that on behalf of our clients. In terms of reporting, we can provide reporting at a very high level, a very detailed level. It's an oversight at global level, or it can also even be at a country level. So we can see cost evolution, we can CO2 evolutions, which of course can be important if you have very strict targets in place and you want to monitor the progress in that area. Also, leasing companies provide economies of scale with regards to their purchasing power. They manage many, many vehicles, and leasing companies, of course, have the in-house knowledge and fleet expertise available to manage vehicles in a way which can be more challenging within your own organization unless you have the in-house capabilities for that. Leasing also provides transparency in terms of fleet costs and also outsourcing solutions. Leasing companies, of course, have this as a core competence, as a core business, and are therefore very well geared up to facilitate the outsourcing tasks of related to fleet. If we go to the next slide for a moment, which then lists the considerations when leasing. So this is then to be taken into account when leasing, that there are, it's a long-term financial commitment, which means there might be possible flexibility concerns, because you would need to ask yourself the question, what could happen now or within 3, 4, or 5 years? It's difficult to anticipate. And part of those areas which is difficult to anticipate is the impact of government measures. We see increased taxation, we see a very fragmented approach to taxation, and there's certainly not a one-size-fits-all across Europe. Also, there's the benefit in kind for the lease car drivers. This also changes from time to time, and we've seen some examples as illustrated by BDO. And we've also seen, for example, in the Netherlands, which was always an example for other countries, or at least was viewed as a possible example, whereby hybrid cars or alternative powertrains were very strongly incentivized. And in fact, it's almost to the contrary what's happened now. Apple is paying a flat fee benefit in kind, 22% added to their taxable income, and the only cars which are still incentivized, the lower benefit in kind rate, are electric cars, and even then they're capped at 50,000 euros. So we see these changes taking place on a regular basis. So there are variable cost elements with leasing. Also, we've got early termination costs, end of contract costs. These are costs which are, of course, are difficult to assess in advance. So in summary, it's a long-term financial commitment which, well, can provide some flexibility concerns. Tor, let me hand over to you for the next slide.
Yeah, and we are already at the summary slide. So thanks for that overview, Mark. Therefore, to summarize, Mark and I, we hope that and we trust that we have been able to explain to you the advantages and the considerations for cash allowance and leasing. And considering our backgrounds, of course, we might be somewhat biased. But if we look at the listings of the pros and cons in an objective way, we believe it is fair to say that in general, leasing is providing the better solution for both the company and the employee. We would advise you, however, to ask yourself these key questions on your objectives: people, planet, profit; on what is the most cost-effective model for your company and your group of employees; what is the impact on the employee, including the risks that are involved, which we touched upon in our previous slides. Needless to say that your leasing providers are happy to assist you in the process to see which concept is best suited for your company and your situation. We hope this was informative to you, and now we would like to hand over back to Stephen again, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Tor, we thought at one moment that you took cash for car and that you were gone away. But it's good that you came back into the webinar room, and thank you also to Mark, of course, for your expertise. I can imagine that the participants in this webinar room, that they will have some questions with regard to what was presented until now. Of course, at the end of the webinar, we will have a little Q&A with the experts, and so if you have a question, you can send your question via the chat function in the webinar tool, and don't forget to mention the name of the expert to whom you would like to address your question, so that I can moderate it also in a correct way. That means that we come now to our case study. As we know, sharing best practices is really of interest and also of importance for corporate fleet managers. And so let's say after the more theoretical part, we are now going to deep dive into a best practice of a global mobility manager. You see him here already with his mobile phone on the screen. It's Daan Bieleveld of Royal DSM. And I hope that Daan, he can hear me. Okay, I think, Daan, if I look right, that you have now unmuted yourself. And so normally you should be well in the webinar room. Is that correct?
Yes, hopefully you can hear me all.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Daan. So Daan, as the Global Mobility Manager of Royal DSM and also the winner of the Fleet Europe Awards 2016, the International Mobility Award, you have already developed quite some alternative mobility solutions with regard to your corporate vehicle fleet. And of course, we would like to understand a little bit more what you have done, why you have done it, and how do you see also the future, let's say, of those alternative mobility solutions for your corporate fleet? Okay?
Yeah, that is exactly what I will cover in my presentation, Stephen. So very good. Yeah, I hope that you enjoy the presentation. I have only 5 slides for you all to handle today, and I hope to stay within well about 10 minutes. Covering who the company is. First of all, in this slide, DSM is a global company. Most of the people I met still know it as a chemical company. We have a very large chemical background, but today we are a health, nutrition, and materials company. And it is also related to our strategy and our mission, and also to our mobility strategy, which will come later in the presentation. My name is Daan Bieleveld. I'm 33 years old, 7 years in the company, and I have various roles in the fleet management area. Started with fleet within the Netherlands and scaled that up from Europe to global, and now it's including the whole travel policy. Next slide, please. So here you see the scope. In total, we have around 21,000, 22,000 employees. In terms of company cars, that's only around 1,800 cars. So around 6% of the employees have a company car. And all the other employees do also use a form of transportation, whether that is by airplane, by train, by car, a private car or company car, or by bike, which I would like to see more in terms of vitality also. These are the forms of mobility that are in scope and what's being handled from my role. The next slide, please. We have a mobility strategy within the company. Yeah, this is a well-known slide to most of you all. I think people, planet, profit, with a couple of the big trends driving for us also the mobility agenda. Which is important to know is we are a health, nutrition, and materials company. Sustainability is our key driver. Mobility is, in terms of emissions, maybe not the largest output for our company, but in visibility and brand recognition, it is a very big part of how we would like to position ourselves. So that's also related to cars, which is one of the most visible benefits that you can give to an employee. Or that you can influence as a company with private leasing, which I will cover in the next slide. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So DSM Private Lease, which is an important starting point. Also, listening to the earlier presenters. We did not start private leasing within the company as an alternative for company cars or as a way to have cash allowances and then steer people to a private leasing model. This is purely done and initiated since we have 20,000 employees, and 96% or 94% of those employees do not have a company car. And it is seen as an important benefit, at least we use it as a benefit in most countries to attract and retain the right employees. So it's a very interesting benefit if you can give some company car or a car benefit to an employee. Yeah, we don't have the money to give every employee a company car, so that was the idea, to have a private leasing system. We questioned if a private leasing, and this was in 2014, could this be cheaper than owning a car if you do an apple-to-apple comparison? And we thought, why not? Because volumes of scale should make it possible to have a cheaper model to do everything by your own, and buying the car and doing everything yourself. At that moment, it was not so clear that what the cost of a car ownership were. So that was one of the big starting points to get clarity on and have a lot of calculations. And we got to the market and asked the leasing companies and how they would see this private leasing schemes. There was a lot of difference in models, including services, but also in pricing, traditional models and completely new models who actually really improved on services and also pricing. So this led in 2014 to a partnership with one new lease supplier, and it is another lease supplier than we have for our corporate business company cars. And we rolled it out in 2015 to the Dutch employees. We started within the Netherlands because there the private lease market was at that time most developed. It maybe still is today. And also there we saw that in terms of pricing, it was a real interesting market with a lot of models and brands being and a good alternative to owning a car. We didn't expect that within 2 months after the go live, already 150 private lease contracts were closed. And we also did not expect that of those 150 private lease cars, there were a lot of D segment cars, quite expensive cars that were calculated and chosen despite we focused on 3 action models. We expected that we should have really cheap cars with limited choice. We gave also the room for employees to calculate any brand, any model, as long as it was below the CO2 cap. All brands were in the portal and could be calculated. But yeah, almost 50% chose a D segment car, which quite surprised me. During the whole process, we see that there's a lot of awareness, but also a lot to gain in awareness on the cost of car ownership versus private leasing. So therefore, I think if you roll out a private leasing program, it is really important to have a cost calculator where people can fill in their current license plate number of their owned car, and that then rolls out what the expected monthly cost of such a car is. And it has to be detailed that people can calculate on some of the components themselves, because they always found that some things they do cheaper or do different. But at the bottom of the line, there will be an amount which in a lot of cases will be higher than an employee is expecting upfront. And that really enables the cost discussion you have with private leasing, because when we started, there was a lot of hesitation. Leasing is expensive. And with the help of this car cost calculator we introduced, it was there was a lot of awareness on that leasing could be even cheaper. And in some cases, a lot cheaper. So we were quite, we did not expect to see the prices of some models which were possible. Also the reason that a lot of the contracts were being closed. And it even led to an internal discussion where the question was raising, why do we even have company cars if a private leasing model is so cost attractive and giving us more flexibility than the company car program. And I think that is also covered by the previous speakers. Next slide, please. We have this discussion internally, and I have here a couple of questions to make it more easy for you guys to ask them. And I think there are good reasons to have a company car program in place for some of the reasons that were mentioned before. I think in terms of safety and sustainability, what we would like to do as a company, for some of the employees, we will still have a company car program in place. I do not think that you should do everything in the private area. Despite we see that today on pricing and costs, there's for some countries not a real good the private leasing is so cost attractive that even including the tax that we see locally, it is sometimes more attractive to start with a private leasing program. Will this stay over the next few years? I do not think so. It's an upcoming alternative and it's priced differently. But it also led to interesting discussions with our current company car provider, of course. So it is also used as an extra trigger to see what is possible in the market. And it's totally in a new way, in a new price model than the traditional company car leasing, which is, I think, very interesting for a fleet manager or mobility manager like me. Interesting to have the both within the company and to learn from each other. I'm also thinking what's happening over the past few years. We did not get many more orders within the private leasing scheme. It's fair to say that this could be because we have a big reorganization within the company that will be finalized end of this year, costing unfortunately a lot of jobs within the Netherlands. So people might extend the choice of choosing for a 3-year contract, a private leasing contract, for that reason. But we also see that it is important to team up with the private leasing company, the supplier, to enable them to have real attractive price offers. And this costs, of course, also time. It has to be managed, where we introduce it as to set it up and let it loose and have the market do its work. But we are now considering to have new action models and a new price level to see if that's creating more orders. And then in the future, we see that more mobility providers are competing. We expect in a couple of years that we could order our Uber car, a self-driving car, in the front of our house, and it will set us off. So then, if that's happening within our generation, then it's you could question whether private leasing is the first step for this pay-per-use model, and even a car monthly abonnement installment, which can be really flexible, and some rental companies are offering it today, is also a very good alternative, I think, and creating even more flexibility. So that's interesting, and I would like to close off with that, and also look forward to the questions and discussions we hopefully have based on these slides. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you for your insight and explaining how you see private lease. We are now coming to the final part of this IFMI webinar, the Q&A part. So if you have a question, please send your question via the webinar chat box and also indicate to which expert you would like to ask your question. We already have some questions. There is one for the people from the leasing companies. So I would like to start with Mark, perhaps. Mark, straightforward question. You talked about the importance, let's say, that you can also calculate a little bit the difference in terms of the advantages, disadvantages of cash allowance versus the company car leasing. So there is a question about how to calculate the cash allowance based on the TCO for company cars. Is there any tool, is there any support in place that you know to really calculate, let's say, the TCO and the cost of cash allowance versus company car?
Yes, thank you, Stephen. Yes, to answer that question, in fact, yes, there are tools available for that. And these tools are available in each individual country in which we operate. And I'm sure the same goes for any other leasing provider as well. The reason why it's so country specific is because the TCO depends on the country, of course, in which you're operating the vehicle, and the same applies to cash allowance. The tax benefits or the upsides, the downsides, all that needs to be taken into place. So to answer your question, yes, it is available. You can reach out to your respective leasing companies, and I'm sure that they can assist you, just like we would be able to make a comparison on the basis of TCO and put that alongside a cash allowance alternative.
Okay, and then perhaps for Tor to go on with that question, can you indicate if you have to do the comparison, let's say, between the TCO of a company car and the amount, the cash allowance that you have to put or can put next to that TCO? What are the, let's say, key criteria to base your calculation on? Because they are not exactly the same, of course.
No, we would sit together with the local fleet manager, and like Mark was also indicating in his previous answer, we would look at the specific situation of the company, and we would look at the specific service setup that is requested, and also look at what is the strategy of the company towards. And again, it sounds a bit how important is the environment? How important is cost? How important is employee satisfaction? So there is not, to say, set criteria. There is a whole bunch of criteria, and it is our expertise to sit with the decision makers and help them to see which criteria are have the most weight on that. Mark, I don't know if you have anything to add to my answer, but
well, Tor,
what I can comment.
Well, I think just for the risk of going into a lot of detail, but maybe just some ideas which can be put forward as well. Obviously, you would look at the vehicle itself, find a comparable vehicle alongside. You would then look at the VAT recoverability. You would look at the tax implication. Private individuals cannot recover VAT in most situations. We look at the maintenance. The maintenance through a leasing provider should be different to that. What a maintenance should be. What the driver would pay if it was themselves. The insurance would also be one area which could be looked at. It's also got to do with the insurance premium itself, because often a leasing company will use the same insurance premium regardless of the insurance history or the loss stats. It's looked at more at a company level rather than an individual level. This may vary in some countries, but on the whole, that's often a scenario. And also looking at the fuel. There's also fuel reimbursement. In some countries that's taxed to a certain limit. In other countries there's more room for that. So all these different areas need to be taken into account, of course. So it really does depend on a number of factors, and that's why you need to look at it in each individual market. But as Tor also mentioned, that is something that leasing companies can do for your organization.
Okay, a question for Nicolas Stockmans of BDO. You started with presenting the legal and the fiscal context, and in there we have for sure seen that elements linked to benefit in kind, linked to the salary tax, and so on, will have an impact, let's say, on the attractiveness of certain new mobility solutions, and for example also the option cash for car. The question here is, can you in a nutshell, just briefly, give some idea about, let's say, countries where already today cash for car based on the taxation scheme might be an interesting option? And secondly, if you look at the taxation evolution, are there any other countries where you expect that they could become also more attractive with regard to cash for car?
To know, the only country where we are aware about a cash for car solution which would be attractive, from a tax perspective, is Belgium. From my perspective, I do not see any other countries with this kind of solutions. But in the future, we think that countries like the Netherlands or the Scandinavian countries will also adopt this kind of solution.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. A question for Dan Bieleveld. Dan, you talked about private lease in your company, and you mentioned that when you launched, let's say, the private lease scheme, that within 2 months you already had, let's say, more than 150 private lease contracts closed. The question, of course, is how has this developed until today, and are you, from a, let's say, mobility manager perspective, satisfied with the figure of 150 if it has stayed 150, of course?
It's difficult to say. We don't have many more orders, so I think that we're around 160 now in total. And what's difficult for me to say if I should be worrying in any kind, because I don't know the real reason. The figure is many more in 2 months than we expected it to be. So it could be that a lot of people were waiting for this private leasing program and extended buying a new car and waited for the program to launch and altogether ordered a private leasing model. It could also be that there is a reason for the employees not to choose for private leasing. We had the feeling that it could be for one of the reasons the big reorganization that is was introduced 2 months after the launch of private lease. But it is also a year later, and so past year, not leading to many more car orders. So what we are doing today is we team up with the leasing company again to see if we can have a nice pricing offer for a couple of cars again, have a communication around it, and then let's see what happens. If that does not lead to many more orders, then we will launch a questionnaire to see what people think of the product. Could also be that the private leasing is today already so mature that people just use our portal or product and our supplier to have more insight on car cost calculations, how services work. And I think, if I'm honest, for some brands, if we see which they already offer today, which wasn't there 2 years ago, then the market is more and more mature. So if we then have a private leasing scheme in the way it is, we started it 2 years ago, it might already be not competing with the market enough to attract car orders. So it's interesting, and must be fair to say that I do not know the exact reason, but it's really interesting to see what's behind this. Yes.
Okay, Dan, thank you very much for the answer, and keep us also updated about, let's say, the development of your private lease initiative. We would definitely be interested to hear more about it when you have new results. We have come to the end of this webinar. I would like to thank Nicolas Stockmans of BDO, Tor Konings of Athlon International, Mark van Eck of ALD International, and Mr. Daan Bieleveld of Royal DSM. There will be a recorded version of this webinar that will be published on our website, fleeteurope.com. In fact, we will have our updated new website by the end of next week. So please take a look, come and visit us, because we will have new added value content on our new Fleet Europe website. And also spare a few minutes, of course, to complete our satisfaction survey, as we would like to optimize our webinars also in the future. And finally, don't miss our live IFMI International Fleet Managers Institute session on the 5th of December in Estoril, where we will talk about taking your international fleet management, to a new and higher level and going global. We will talk about missions, responsibilities, challenges, and trends. And of course, there will be quite some case studies and networking possibilities with your peers, and we hope to see you there. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope to meet with you again in an upcoming IFMI webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.